boyfriend cheats with my step-sibling, I trick him into believing in a non-existent trust fund, leading to his parents kicking him out. Hello, Reddit community. I have been meaning to share my story here for a long time, but I kept putting it off. Now that I have a Reddit account, I figured it was the right time to finally post it. When I was approximately 17 years old, I began seeing a guy who was 19 years old. For the purposes of this post, I will refer to him as Jake. The age of consent in my area is 16, so everything was legal. We got along well, spent considerable time together, and truly cared for one another. Conversations about living together once we both moved out even came up. We appeared to be a perfectly content couple, or so I believed. After a few months of dating, Jake changed. He became noticeably more distant. When we were together, he frequently checked his phone. Our time together diminished, and he grew uncomfortable with public displays of affection, like holding hands. He also seemed increasingly indifferent to my emotions. I had a bit of a preference for being humiliated in bed, nothing extreme, and we had discussed what was acceptable and what was not. However, he started becoming increasingly degrading. He would tell me that no one could possibly love me, picking at my insecurities. There were moments when I broke down in tears after he said such things. To his credit, for the initial instances, he would halt his actions, apologize, and hold me until I felt better. But eventually, that ceased, and he started rolling his eyes, telling me to grow up. It was as if he had transformed into a completely different person. The insults began to infiltrate our daily interactions. He frequently commented on my appearance, brought up my family troubles. I was going through significant family issues at the time, and reminded me about my past relationships before we began dating, which were a sort of rebellion against my family problems. If I showed any signs of distress, he would simply leave the room and allow me to cry alone. I started to believe that the deterioration of our relationship was my fault. Perhaps I just wasn't enough for him. Deep down, I suspected he was being unfaithful to me, a suspicion confirmed when I received a message from a guy named David on Facebook. He informed me that he had been sleeping with Jake. David expressed his regrets and mentioned that he ended things with Jake as soon as he learned about our relationship. I couldn't be angry with David. It wasn't his fault. We talked for hours, and I reassured him that he had no reason to feel guilty. David also helped me stop rationalizing Jake's behavior. He was a true blessing during that time. What truly shattered me occurred shortly after the affair came to light. Our arguments escalated. Then Jake did something utterly inexcusable. You see, I had a troubled relationship with my father for many years. He constantly cheated on my mother and eventually settled down and had children with a woman he had been seeing behind her back. He attempted some form of relationship with me until I was about 13 or 14, when he decided he didn't love me as much as his other children, leading to a complete severance of contact. This experience devastated me, and even now, it is painful to recall. So, Jake went out of his way to track down one of my step-siblings online and slept with them. The following day, he boasted about it, and my step-sibling posted about it online, garnering messages from their friends claiming I deserved what happened to me. This was arguably the lowest point in my life. I loathed myself, partly for allowing it to transpire and partly because I had begun to believe the hurtful things they said. During this turbulent time, my only source of comfort was David. I didn't want to burden my friends with my issues, and David was one of the few individuals who truly understood what Jake was like. We conversed for several weeks, and the topic of revenge eventually came up. I had attempted to end things a couple of months prior due to Jake's terrible conduct, but he bombarded me with apologies, insisting that he didn't mean any of it and would never behave that way again. He even spoke to some of my family members who, unknowingly, encouraged me to reconcile with him, claiming we were such a sweet couple. I had refrained from sharing the specifics of our breakup, opting to keep things vague, although I suspected some of them saw my step-sibling's post and understood why I didn't want to be with him. After weeks of discussions and strategizing, I finally reached my breaking point and decided to act. My father was not particularly wealthy, but he had a well-paying job, allowing him to live rather comfortably. During my childhood, he spread rumors that he had established a trust fund for me that would ensure I could move into my own place by the time I turned 18, along with some extra funds. I knew this was complete nonsense. He constantly tried to evade child support payments, so there was no way he would have set up a trust fund for me. However, Jake was unaware of this. We rarely discussed it, but he had heard the rumors, and I merely reiterated what I had told him. My father was a terrible parent who begrudged paying child support, so why would he ever create a trust fund for me? Nevertheless, Jake persisted in believing it. He even did his own research into my father's occupation and estimated his earnings. To give him some credit, he would drop the subject when I asked him to, at least for a while. I decided to turn this to my advantage. Jake and I were still together, although I took every opportunity to avoid him. One night, I sat him down and mentioned that, with my 18th birthday approaching, I had started to consider the prospect of us living together, thanks to the trust fund my father supposedly set up for me. His spirits lifted instantly, and honestly, that evening was likely the first time in months he said something kind to me without the presence of others. This almost made me reconsider my plan, but later that night, David reminded me that Jake would revert to his old, degrading behavior in no time. We began looking at apartments together, with Jake being generous enough to let me make the ultimate decisions and handle the paperwork. His rationale was that he couldn't possibly cheat on me while managing the lease details. To be honest, I was a bit taken aback since I had always assumed he would want his name on the lease to ensure I couldn't kick him out. By that point, he had already slept with my step-sibling, belittled me, shattered my self-esteem, and cheated on me regularly, so he likely believed I wouldn't have the audacity to kick him out regardless of what he did. I started taking extra shifts at work to save enough money to be able to move out. But I had no intention of cohabiting with Jake. Instead, I planned to move in with my friend, Emma. We had been contemplating living together for some time, so we figured, why not share an apartment? We found a charming one-bedroom flat near our college and work, and we began preparations to move in. I also wanted to prevent any trouble from coming to my mother's door in the event Jake created a scene. Emma assured me she would handle him if he ever showed up at our doorstep. Then came the next phase of the plan. About a week before Jake and I were meant to move into our new apartment, I took his phone when he wasn't paying attention. Jake had become careless, leaving his phone unattended at times, often boasting about how fortunate he was to sleep with whoever he pleased and return home to, a little bitch, who would prepare his meals. While he was in the shower that day, he didn't bother to take his phone with him. This was perfect. I accessed his phone, deleted my number from his contacts, and changed his mom's contact name to mine. Feeling satisfied with my work, I went to the kitchen and smashed one of my mother's plates. It was an inexpensive one from a local store, and I replaced it shortly after. I left for work after finishing everything. My mother had gone to work a couple of hours earlier, so she was out of the house. I just needed a reason for him to lose his temper. Oh, and he certainly lost it. His initial response was to text me, hurling every vile name imaginable. The twist was, he hadn't texted me at all. Instead, it went to his mother. I had warned her in advance that she should prepare for a revelation about her son's true nature. She had never defended him as much as she was just unaware of how terrible his behavior had become. She had previously confronted him a few times when he treated me poorly in her presence. She went crazy. I never learned all the details of their argument, but she called him, angrily confronting him about his despicable actions and finally recognizing how dreadful he was. The situation escalated when she received screenshots of some of his admissions regarding his infidelity. She was utterly appalled by his behavior and contacted me to apologize on his behalf. However, it was not her fault. He was old enough to act like an adult. He ended up dismissing her concerns, essentially declaring that her opinion was irrelevant because he would still be moving in with me. Needless to say, when he called me on Facebook after I had deleted my number from his phone, I took satisfaction in informing him that we wouldn't be moving in together. The trust fund was a fabrication. I had previously told him this, but he refused to accept it, and that I had moved in with Emma. He unleashed an array of insults, referring to me with every disparaging term imaginable, but eventually, his words turned into background noise. I informed him that our relationship was over and ended the call, blocking him on all platforms. He had to return, tail between his legs, to his parents, who initially took him back for a short period. However, after a while, the arguments escalated to a breaking point, and his parents ultimately kicked him out. He then stayed with a few friends for several months until he found his own place. His relationship with his parents, particularly his mother, has changed drastically since. Occasionally, I still talk to his mother. Finally, David and I took it upon ourselves to send screenshots of Jake's abusive messages to as many people he had been involved with as possible. We spent several sleepless nights tracking down those individuals on Facebook. Part of this was an act of retribution against Jake, but mostly, we wanted to ensure that none of them fell into a serious relationship with him and encountered the same torment I had endured. So that's my story of revenge. This may seem quite lengthy, so I have provided a summary below. I never intended to share my experience, but while scrolling through Facebook recently, I noticed one of Jake's new accounts in the People You May Know section. After discussing it with Emma, she encouraged me to post it here, and I hope it fits within this subreddit. Summary. My boyfriend transformed into a disloyal jerk and ended up sleeping with one of my step-siblings, intending to hurt me, especially since I have no communication with my father. I played into the rumor that my dad had established a trust fund, which he had not, deceiving him into believing we could live together while ruining his relationship with his parents. Ultimately, he got kicked out and I moved in with a friend. I also shared screenshots of his abusive texts with all his partners to prevent them from making the same mistake I did. Edit, thank you for the supportive comments and awards. I'm doing much better now. This all happened a few years ago, and I have not encountered Jake since. Furthermore, I noticed some confusion regarding the plate incident. I was already at work by the time he got out of the shower, so he was unable to confront me. Additionally, my mother was at work, so I didn't leave her alone with him. No worries there. I've updated my original post to clarify this detail for those who might not see the addendum. Lastly, I saw several comments inquiring about my gender. I am a bisexual male, as was Jake. I hope this clears up any misunderstandings. Story 2. In just 1.5 years, I lost my girlfriend, then my mom to a heart attack, got in a car crash, moved homes thrice, and faced a terror attack. Jumping right in. It all began in August 2023, when my girlfriend of 5 years unexpectedly informed me that she wished to end our relationship. We had been living with my mother for 3 years, and had just transitioned into our own apartment earlier that year. I believed we could manage to fulfill our lease together, allowing her more time to find a new place without me taking on the full rent. I was mistaken, as she had mentally separated from me months prior, finally acting on it when she had completely moved on. This situation created an imbalance where one person desperately needed support to keep progressing, while the other preferred to focus on herself. The ensuing emotional agony over the next month was immense as I clung to something that was already lost. Being deprived of both physical and emotional comfort from her, while she quickly began dating and connecting with others, caused this to be the most enduring trauma I had experienced during that time. Ultimately, we parted ways after I managed to terminate our lease early and moved back in with my mother. During that period, my mother was my primary source of support. We lived and worked closely together, and I held immense love and gratitude for her. However, it only took 5 months until January 2024 for my life to be turned upside down once more. On January 3, 2024, I was driving home from work when I noticed a car on the side of the road surrounded by fire trucks. I drove around it and continued my journey home. Later that day, I learned it was my mother's vehicle. She had suffered a heart attack while driving home from work and passed away that day. In that moment, I felt completely lost. Fortunately, my brother and his wife offered to take me in immediately. Just 2 days later, on January 5, 2024, I was en route to my father's house to store some of my belongings when I was rear-ended by a van. My car was deemed a total loss, and I sustained a herniated disc in my neck, which caused me daily headaches for the following 8 months. After my grieving period, I dove headfirst into work. I held 2 jobs and averaged 65 to 80 hours per week between them. However, in avoiding my grief and the multiple upheavals I had endured, my productivity began to decline. I soon started receiving verbal and written warnings for lateness and a lack of productivity. As frustration mounted, it spilled over into my home life, where I lived with my brother, his wife, and their 2 young daughters. My brother had worked diligently to build a career and family he could take pride in. They all simply wanted to help restore the little pride and confidence I had before these tragedies struck. I knew this, yet I felt like I was continually falling short of their expectations. The pressure of these imagined expectations became overwhelming, so I decided my best course of action was to change my living environment once more. In April 2024, I moved out of my brother's house and into a duplex that I would be renting with a high school friend. He was set to join me in June, as he had a few matters to resolve prior to his move. Despite relocating to a place that was merely a 2-minute walk to one job and a 10-minute drive to the other, my ability to wake up on time remained non-existent. Living alone ultimately hindered my capacity to avoid and numb the immense pain that had been trying to catch up with me for months. I struggled with depression, or what I believed was depression, for years, experiencing episodes characterized by a lack of enjoyment, no motivation, and suicidal thoughts. The most intense episode I had experienced up until that point was about to unfold. Symptoms included crying spells, inability to concentrate, loss of enjoyment, lack of motivation, and daily suicidal ideation lasting for hours. This came to a breaking point when I frantically searched for inpatient mental health facilities, called the first number I found, and booked the first flight to Florida. I informed my jobs that I would be absent for a month and left immediately for Still Mind Behavioral Health in Fort Lauderdale. At that time, I was unaware of what a residential facility entailed and assumed it was simply an outpatient clinic where one could reside. I was mistaken. All my possessions were taken from me, and I was made to understand early on that if I wanted to leave the facility, I would need to either put forth a considerable effort or endure the entire 30 days. I chose to endure, believing that this place was meant to assist my mental health. I was under continuous supervision by staff and cameras and shared the space with individuals who increased my anxiety. Do not misunderstand me. Overall, I believe I emerged better than I entered, but this improvement came after an incredibly long 30 days of working on myself. Upon returning home, my roommate had moved in by this point, so I decided to take some time before resuming work. This may have been a misjudgment on my part. The progress I had made in Florida gradually began to regress, as I found it challenging to readjust and maintain routines. I began avoiding friends and family and neglected my self-care. I ultimately decided to quit one of my jobs without even returning to it after my hiatus. Overall, this was not the worst decision I made. Quickly realizing I needed additional support, I enrolled in an outpatient clinic where I made genuine progress for a period. I was diagnosed with bipolar Roman II during this time, a diagnosis that continues to cause me inner conflict. However, shortly after enrolling, the facility closed its doors due to financial difficulties. I must have gained just enough stability to stand firm, as the subsequent months passed with only minor setbacks. I experienced a few months of simply yearning for the love and affection lost with the departure of the two most significant women in my life. This ultimately brought me to January 2025. For context, I reside in New Orleans. The first day of 2025 began with the terrorist attack on Bourbon Street. My roommate and I were nearly caught up in it, having discussed going there to celebrate New Year's. Sadly, my coworker was not as fortunate and lost his life in the incident. I work with both his father and brother. While I wouldn't say I was particularly close with this coworker, just 3 weeks later, one of my close colleagues suffered what can only be described as a severe mental health crisis. On January 18, 2025, Glenn Bone Jr. created a horrific situation at his home, tragically shooting and killing his wife and 2-year-old daughter while also injuring his 9-year-old and 13-year-old daughters. The situation concluded when police entered the home after being alerted by the 13-year-old and fatally shot Glenn after he brandished his weapon. None of this made sense to any of us who knew him, and we made no progress in understanding it over the following days. All I can say is that I hope those 2 little girls never face any further hardships. I learned about this incident while working at a Mardi Gras ball. I managed to get through the day in a state of shock and numbness. Yet, that was not the only significant event to occur on that day. At the ball, I encountered the drummer from my old band, who is now a detective with the New Orleans Police Department. He was present the night of the Bourbon Street attack, and we exchanged thoughts about that evening and my coworker, who was among the victims. I discovered that this man, whom I had not seen in years, was the first on the scene and attempted to revive my coworker. I realized the family had received almost no details regarding the circumstances of his death, and telling them that he was not alone during his last moments had to hold great significance for them. The burden of conveying such heavy news weighed on me, leading me to write a letter to his father sharing this information. He expressed deep gratitude. Now, we arrive at the present. It has been a year and a half since my breakup, 1 year, 1 month, and 3 days since my mother passed away, 1 year, 1 month, and 1 day since my accident, 7 months since my stay at a residential mental health facility, 1 month and 5 days since the local terrorist attack, and 19 days since my coworker took the lives of his wife and child. I am unsure how to conclude this vent other than to say that, despite the hellish experiences, I feel I am in a relatively good place for myself. I hope those who are aware of everything I have been through see me as someone who has endured these experiences and emerged better than expected. I still miss my ex. I still miss my mother. I still miss my coworkers, but I also continue to move forward.